It's time for a new perspective with your host, Pastor Mike Sherbino, with your daily dose of how much Jesus is with us. If you're ready for some inspiration and help getting through these tough times, then listen in today as Mike interviews a whole host of people from all walks of life, thought leaders, seekers, and followers, all to hear God's voice who speaks in all languages. So sit back and relax, and don't worry, this isn't a show about what you need to do to be loved by God. It's a show about a whole lot of good news. From a mighty church just outside of Toronto, here's Mike Sherbino.
Again, we're glad you're with us today. And Ashley, I'm glad you're here.
Thanks.
This is
Thanks
always
for
a treat.
having me.
Yeah, from coming back from the West Coast to see the old man, that's pretty cool. And, around the table, we have all sorts of conversations, don't we?
We certainly do. Yep.
And we often talk about issues, political issues, social issues. I'm excited today to have an organization and their executive director, their president, the EFC is with us today. An organization that is, I'd like to say, pushing back against a secular agenda and promoting Christian values in the country. They've been doing it for years. And I want to welcome David Guretzki. Thank you for being with us and coming on the program.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
And, as I was thinking about what I just said, pushing back against an agenda, it stands to reason that everybody brings agendas. We often say to people, what's your hidden agenda? Maybe you could begin, David, and congratulations on your new role.
Thank you.
As president, that's exciting. But talk to us about who is the EFC? What's their agenda?
Okay. Well, the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada is the National Association of Evangelical Denominations, post-secondary Christian schools, and Christian organizations. So we have about 46 denominations,
wow,
33 schools, and about 70 ministry organizations and a bunch of other congregations, representing about 7,000 congregations across Canada. So in terms of what we do, I often use the acronym CARE. We do collaboration together with our affiliates. We do advocacy on public policy issues. We do research on the church in Canada, and we produce all kinds of resources for equipping. So we care for you. That's really what we do.
That's exciting. Ashley,
I was going to say, you're starting to unpack this, but can you just tell us a little bit more about some specific initiatives that are on the table right now?
Sure. Well, two current research projects that we just finished. We have the Center for Research on Church and Faith. The two major research projects that we did with various partners, one of them was on parenting faith, it's called. And we, together with about 17 other partners, looked at how do parents actually see their role in discipling their children alongside the church, and what's the relationship of the parents and what's to faith, and how do they view that working in with the church. And so that was a study that's just been released, all kinds of interesting insights, some of them kind of common sense, but other of them a little bit eye-opening. So, for example, one of them is that unlike perhaps parents of a previous generation that saw their role as actually really directing their children towards the faith, parents today tend to think of it more as a bit of a dialogue with their kids. And they really want their kids to be exploring the faith, but parents often feel like they don't want to kind of force their faith onto their kids and to allow their kids to make choices for themselves. So that presents, a different way of parenting, a different way of modeling the faith, but is definitely different than previous generations. And so we have to take account for that, how that actually changes how we do discipleship of our kids.
So David, how are you going to spin this out? And it's very interesting because I'm also a pastor, so I'm processing, live right now, thinking, okay, how's that going to impact the way we do Christian education in the church, how we do youth ministry? Have you been able to give that any thought, or is it still premature?
Well, so one of the findings that was really interesting, there's an interplay between, our social media, our internet generation, our screen generation, and how they spend so much time on their screen. And how short those episodes are, how quickly we see things going past us on the screen. So we have to take account of that our kids their attention spans, are pretty short, and there's all kinds of things vying for their attention. So one of the neat things that we found out in the study was how transition moments in a day are so important for discipling. It's not necessarily, spending half an hour sitting down with your kid and having some kind of Bible lesson that might be interesting, but it's those short times, riding in the car, just before for supper, the conversation around the table, even those short prayers with your kids, before bed. Those are really short but crucial moments that were identified as actually being significant for helping kids mature and grow in their faith. And so we have to modify our expectations about how long we can spend, and actually think about how can we have meaningful moments with our kids, while recognizing that we also have to safeguard against the distraction that social media has. And that was a major concern for parents, because kids are distracted by social media.
I really like that point. It actually speaks to developing a rhythm in the life of a child, where you're inputting and having that conversation, but it actually makes it much more continuous throughout the day then. So I think that's a really unique perspective.
Absolutely.
What are some of the other initiatives that you're involved with as well?
So we have significant initiatives around another research project on small churches. About 70% of churches in Canada are under 150 people. So most people who actually go to church are probably attending small churches. And yet oftentimes when there's training for pastors and so on, there's often kind of an assumption that training is for large churches. And so we explored some of the dynamics of what it's like to be a leader or pastor of a small church. Often they're bivocational or volunteer, and very localized, and there's very particular kind of expectations that pastors in small contexts have. And small doesn't just necessarily mean rural either. Sometimes we confuse rural with small, but there's hundreds of small churches even within urban settings. And they do actually have a significantly different flavor than some of the larger churches that often tend to focus a little bit more on the program.
So are you going to be unpacking this just simply through printed material or online where they can access it, or are you going to be teaching this material? Because a lot of times if you're pastoring in a small church, you might feel, oh, I'm less than significant, I'm not successful, and that's a whole subject in itself. I'm kind of curious, how are you going to get this into the hands of people so that, I can say this as a pastor, because you only have 50 people in your church, you're not a loser.
That's right, yeah. Well, the materials themselves, like the whole research reports, are available free online. And because we've partnered with our affiliate denominations and organizations, each of the organizations that we partnered on for both of these projects are going to be unpacking it relative to their ministry context. So we own the research together, but each of the organizations and ministries are going to be unpacking the implications really much more directly to their own context. Some are camps, for example, with the parenting faith, and others are denominations. And so they're going to look at the data. That data is available to everyone, but they're each going to produce their own sort of resources. But we're also writing articles. We're doing some podcasts on this, getting exposure even to the research, even through a show like this. So there's multiple ways in which we're going to be rolling these out. These are both very fresh. They're just came out in the last couple of months.
Cool.
And we know there's some other initiatives too that are at the forefront. And one of them we're going to be looking at a little bit further just after we take this break. And that's the whole element of MADE.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so folks, I just want to encourage you to stay with us. We're going to be back with the new president of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, David Guretzki, and we're going to talk about medical assistance in dying. Stay with us.
For those of us who follow Jesus, we have a book. It isn't a theology book. It isn't a rule book. This book is a story. The story of God and humanity. A story Jesus said he was fulfilling. This book contains poems, riddles, letters, puzzling narratives, and new ideas. Yet, throughout it all, this book is full of the breath of God. For those of us who follow Jesus, this book is a treasure. This book is a tree of life. This book is a page turner. Turn the page with us.
We're back with David Guretzki, who is the new president of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. As we said just before the break, we want to talk about MAID, which stands for Medical Assistance in Dying. David, I was on an airplane flying into Winnipeg a couple years ago, and sitting beside me was a lady, a professional counselor, and she talked about how she was having to work with some of the hospitals in providing counsel to doctors who were dealing with a lot of emotional trauma because they had participated in MAID. I mean, that's a whole subject in itself. Maybe we're going to touch on it, but it sets the framework for what the EFC is doing in Canada to address this sensitive issue. And we recognize that there are people that hold different postures on this, but tell us about the EFC's position and what you're trying to do to address this sensitive subject.
Well, in terms of the position that we've taken right from the outset when MAID started to be talked about in about 2015, I mean, we've taken a position of moral and biblical objection to the whole practice of MAID right from the start. And we've tried to outline why, life is sanctified by God, why God loves all people, created in his image. We're his image bearers. And so we've talked a lot about, on the one end, our opposition to MAID in general. But at the same time, we're trying to recognize that, yes, there's all kinds of people who are, and probably the majority of Canadians are actually in favor of MAID. And what that's, I think, helped us to understand is to say, even though we're differing on our position on medical assistance in dying, I think most people who are talking about it from the perspective of those who suffer. And so we recognize that, yes, when someone reaches, certain stages of illness, terminal illness, it can be a lot of suffering. And I think both us and the general public in general, we're concerned about how do we respond to suffering. And I think where we part ways is that from our perspective, we're saying suffering is something that is certainly part of the brokenness of creation, but we're called upon to serve those who suffer, not to end their lives, not to end the suffering per se, but to meet people where they're at in their suffering.
So
and
can
so
I
think
jump
that's
in for
a
a
crucial
minute?
part of our response.
Yeah, well said. Time is limited. So I want to ask this question. The suffering issue, I can sort of get my head around it, but you guys are looking at it also from the 30,000 feet. What is your concern 5 years from now when we think about
Right.
assistance in dying? Who can end their life and the choices, especially when we ponder the sanctity of life? What is your concern
Right.
from that perspective?
So our I can talk about from the current and the future. From the current perspective, like there is a plan to expand medical assistance in dying to those with mental illness alone. And also there's discussion about mature minors, those under the age of 18, whether they can consent to having medical assistance in dying. Our broader and long-term concern is that medical assistance in dying seems to be an easy way to deal with suffering rather than addressing the root issues of why people are suffering or what they're lacking in the midst of their suffering. This seems like a way that the direction is going to say, well, we may not be able to deal with someone who's fully dealing with mental illness issues, for example. And so we open up MAID to those types of people. But what it's doing is it's taking pressure off of governments and medical societies and so on to say, well, what we have to do is actually provide better care for these people. And instead, we're focusing on how to end their suffering, in our opinion, far too prematurely. And so my concern is that we should be looking at, we're already, we are opposed to MAID right from the outset, but really MAID should be the least of all desirable options. Like that, they should be the last option. And the only way that's going to become the last option is when there's proper supports for people, whether there's disabled people, mentally ill people, even young people who are suffering.
I appreciate what you're saying. You're talking about there's something else deeper that's motivating sometimes these decisions, which is really critical. How do you
Yeah.
think we have that conversation with someone that's opposing?
Yeah.
What are the types of things that we can say to raise this level of awareness, or perhaps to change the question that people are even asking?
Well, it's interesting that you started out, Mike, about talking about the social side of it. When people are receiving aid, they're actually asked a series of questions. The medical establishment is required to ask questions, and often they're asked, "Why are you receiving aid?" And surprisingly, most people don't say that it's intolerable pain or the amount of suffering that they're facing, but it's a loss of social connection and a loss of meaning that they're facing. And so they often feel isolated. They often feel like they've lost purpose in life. Well, I say, who better to come alongside people who are looking for meaning, who are looking for social companionship, social friendship, than the church, right? And so I think it's just fascinating to me that people do want meaning in their lives, and it's often at those critical moments, like during terminal illness or in deep mental anguishes, that people start asking those questions. What does my life mean? Well, this is where I think that the church needs to come in and come alongside people and listen to those stories and offer comfort and offer hope.
Okay, let me wade into the water a little deeper. I want to be careful how I say this. It's very easy to say, oh, this is a liberal agenda, or this is a conservative agenda, or NDP or Green or whatever. It's easy to point the finger, but I'm not sure. I think it's a larger agenda that's embraced by people of all walks of life, as you said that. Why do you think it is that?
So I think we have been, especially in the Western world, particularly those of us who've had life a little bit more comfortable and the conveniences of life, when those comforts and conveniences are taken away from us, we don't really know necessarily how to live our lives. In many parts of the world where comfort and convenience is not part of the daily struggle, they tend to think about suffering far more often in their daily lives than we do, when suffering seems to be sort of isolated to certain moments in our life. So I think that if we're honest, church, non-church, Christian, non-Christian, we're all very well accustomed to being comfortable. And whenever hard things come along, we're much more attuned to say, well, what's the quick solution here? What's the most convenient thing here? So I think that's a difficult thing for us to admit, but I think it's the truth.
I think that's a really wise point, because our comforts are often, it's our idol in life. And even when we do branch out, we see people living in different areas and different cultural experiences. Suffering can be a part of their day-to-day life, and trying to get out of suffering isn't the objective. So it shifts where your focus is, and it shifts even how you identify what's something that's meaningful in life. Hard suffering doesn't actually equate to it shouldn't happen or it should be the end.
And I think it becomes a huge opportunity for the church to rise up and to embrace and provide comfort to people in the name of Jesus.
Absolutely.
I'm sure you agree with that.
I'm just reminded of the words of St. Paul in the book of Ephesians, where he says, I want to know Christ and I want to know the power of his resurrection. And as Christians, we say, absolutely, I want to know that. But he follows that up by saying, and sharing in the fellowship of sufferings. And so we kind of say, well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, right? But really, the Christian walk has always embraced the cross. It's always embraced that we have crosses to bear, crosses of suffering, and that Jesus himself went ahead of us and bore suffering in unimaginable ways. He didn't recoil from suffering, but he bore it. That doesn't mean suffering's a good thing. I think suffering's part of the fallenness of the world, but Christians know that we can bear suffering with the help of God.
David, our time is up, but I just want to say to our viewers, I want to encourage them to support the work of the EFC, and through their financial support and prayer, you're able to make a difference on our behalf, and we're grateful for that. We're looking forward to having you back on the program in a week or two as we talk more about the issues that Canadians are dealing with. David Guretzki, President of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, I want to thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Ashley. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Well, one thing that really just struck me from that interview with David is that I think sometimes we don't ask the right questions about why certain things have emerged within society and why we're doing the things that we're doing.
Yeah, we didn't talk about these things 30, 40 years ago.
No, but what he was actually just saying around MAID is we don't always ask the right questions about what's the rationale, what's the reason behind wanting this in life, wanting to end life, wanting it.
And I thought that was very insightful as he talked about, especially our culture. And I think as you brought it, versus other cultures where they're used to living with incredible suffering, pain, and that's part of the struggle of life, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think we can get used to a way of living. We can get used to a comfortable life. And then we think something else is wrong. And we don't look and even always say, okay, what's God trying to show me through this? What's he teaching me? And is actually the power of the cross and knowing that he suffered enough to deal with our brokenness in the midst of everything.
And you know, Ashley, as I've been telling our viewers all this week, I've been teaching on the importance of trust. And when you're suffering, when you're going through hard times and you feel like ending it, what does it look like to trust in God?
Yeah. I also think that doesn't take away from being empathetic and understanding and listening to people and helping to carry other people's burdens. But can we look also to Jesus and what he's done as a solution?
Hey, so folks, stay with us. We're going to be right back in just a moment as we open up God's Word for you today. You know, through this past week, we've been talking about trusting in God. What does it look like? And yesterday I shared that lame but true story when one of my daughters was about 8 years old and she got me to go up on a zip line. And as you jump out, you know, your heart is in your mouth. I only did it because as the old man, I'm supposed to do that kind of thing if your 8-year-old is already way ahead of you. But my goodness, there was about a 150-pound difference. And I wondered, would that steel cable hold me? And sometimes we wonder, will God hold us? Is he strong enough? Is he capable enough? And as we unpack today what David was sharing about the mandate of the EFC to talk about suffering from a perspective where we need to encourage one another, to walk with one another. And the sanctity of life is so important to not just write it off, to not just sign out and say, hey, you know what, I'm going to pack it in and catch the next bus out of here because life is too hard. God says he wants to give us his strength. He wants us to be there to comfort people who are going through hard times. He wants the church to rise up like it never has before in this day and age, and to be his hands and his feet, to be there to provide comfort. And as we think about that, as we're talking to people who are suffering, going through incredible difficult times, and not for a moment am I trying to minimize your suffering or what you are going through. But what we come back to is the same question: can God be trusted? Does he really understand what I'm going through, the pain, the suffering, the challenges that I am having in life? We said yesterday in the verse in Proverbs chapter 3 where Solomon wrote, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. He will direct you. We said that the trust, it looks like reckless abandonment, when I just surrender and say, God, here I am. But you notice he says with all our heart, not just part of our heart. The heart is the center of our emotions. And some days, if I'm honest, my emotions can be up, and the next day they can be down. Different things influence our emotions. Even pain and suffering can influence our emotions. I remember last year when I went through a period of sickness for many days in the hospital, I became conscious of the fact that it was much easier for me to be cranky and grumpy and miserable. Circumstances were dictating, even though there were physical circumstances, were dictating my emotion. And I had to choose in the midst of that to trust and say, God, I don't know what's happening. I don't want to be here in this place, but I'm going to believe that you have a plan and you're working it out. And here's a strange thing. What had to happen in my life to change how I was handling the pain and the suffering was that I had to choose joy. I had to remind myself of the promises of God, saying, God, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to rejoice in you, that even though I don't like what I'm going through, even though my body is reacting and I don't enjoy this at all, it's painful, it's hard, that here I'm going to trust you. I'm going to believe that you have a plan for everything. And that's why it says with all of our heart. I have to trust God with my failures. You ever have that experience when you've given it your best shot and you just feel like it didn't happen, it didn't work? And yet the Spirit of God is coming along and saying, I want to encourage you to get up, to keep pressing on. I can't help but remember a dear lady, Winnie English, who passed away years ago. She had lost a leg from a car accident. She was battling cancer. When I visited her, she was just a frail wisp of a woman. And I thought, what's a 22 or 23-year-old pastor going to say to this lady who was about 60 years of age, who had experienced nothing but suffering for the last 40 years of her life? I remember walking into her hospital room. It was the Princess Margaret Hospital in Toronto. And she motioned for me to draw close. And if I close my eyes, I can still feel the faint breath from her lips as she whispered into my ear this amazing truth. And do you know what it was? She said, Michael, God's grace is sufficient. God's grace is sufficient. And that's the challenge with all of these things, including MAID, that when we take God out of the equation, we don't experience his grace and his help in the time of need. Solomon wrote, he said, trust God with all your heart. Trust him with your failures, with your disappointments, and even with your fear. And fear is real. I know what it's like. Many times in the course of the week, I have to battle it. But I come to God and say, God, I want to give you my fear. I want to trust you. I'm going to believe that you're there, that you're with me. You're not going to fail me or forsake you. And I want to remind you today that as you reach out to Jesus, wherever you're at, whatever you're going through, and saying, Lord, I want to trust you, he will hear that prayer. He will be the friend that sticks closer than a brother. Ask him today to be your Savior, to be your friend.